Hi, I'm Angela Poch, and this is another video on psychology made practical. Today, I would like to talk a bit about labels. So I'm going to define labels as some term that is used to describe oneself or someone else in terms of their behavior, their personality, or their functioning. It's a pretty general overall view of the word labels. And I want to approach this from the fact that labels can be both positive and negative. They can be both embraced and scorned upon. And they can also be misunderstood or misused. So with that, let me tell you a little about some of my labels, and then maybe I can draw some lessons from that. So one of my labels is hyperactive. I mean, ADHD is the modern term, but when I was diagnosed was a little while ago, revealing my age. And so we were given the title hyperactive, those of us who could not sit still for more than 2 minutes or less. And to be honest, I've always loved it. I've never had a problem with it. In fact, I kind of embraced it and I kind of like it because it really does describe who I am. It doesn't have anything negative in my mind, and it does in other people's mind for sure, because other people are like, oh, she's hyperactive, you know, like to my mom, like, oh, you poor thing. Now, that label is also, of course, a diagnostic term and should not be used just because you feel ADHD, or you watch a video that says you're ADHD. Like, for instance, I watched one on autism and Asperger's, and I'm like answering 95% yes to like everything he said. It was like he was talking out of my head. I was like, holy smokes. And I mean, like, I have the DSM-5. Well, it's not there. It's there in my library of books, psychology books. And I have looked at the diagnoses, and I knew I checked most of the boxes. But of course, you can't self-diagnose even if you are, you know, a counselor. Well, counselors don't diagnose anyways. We leave that to the doctors. Anyways, that aside, we can often relate to these stories, and lots of times even without a proper doctor's labeling you, sometimes the labels feel invalidated. There's one life lesson right there when it comes to psychology. So it's true that we can easily get sucked into believing we have a bunch of things and conditions that we don't have. It is extremely common for nurses and doctors to think they have a bunch of diseases after they've studied pathology. Like, it's just kind of like human nature. We do relate. We're kind of naturally wanting to relate to others, which is like a really beautiful thing. We should be embracing that part of ourselves. It shows compassion and empathy, that we have this natural inclination to want to be understanding of other people. You could look at it in the negative. We want to be like people so we can be liked by people. It's true. There is always that negative side of it, the self side. Anywho, that's one aspect of psychology and labeling, right? Is this diagnostic labeling so that you can get treatment, help, medications, sometimes extra support in school, like for children. That's where labels can be helpful. Other ways labels can be helpful. They can be helpful in identifying certain characteristics that so you can understand the person better. For example, the label, you know, on the spectrum, this Asperger's spectrum, but you know, not everybody gets diagnosed. And some people get really offended if you relate to that without an official diagnosis, which I think is a real shame. And I feel really bad for those of you who feel like you have to get this official diagnosis for people to recognize that you feel this way and you're thinking this way. Like, you don't, like, a diagnosis doesn't change your brain. It's really a matter of, you know, how's it working for you, and how can you find tools to help you improve, and how can you find tools to adapt. That's as far as the labels really go. But labels can also be a problem or a challenge or derogatory. And sometimes we identify with a certain group and yet we're labeled as another one. And that's really hard, like especially those of us who have challenging ways of looking at the world, let me put it that way. Another label, cultural labels. I have an Italian background, at least partly. My mom comes from like the more Eastern, not Eastern, that's not the right word, like England, Ireland, I'm trying to think of the other term, Baltics, I think that's what they call it as well. Like, anyways, my dad is half Italian, we think. He was foster. Another label, kind of. What's a description, right? So, I mean, some of these labels are just descriptions. They're just kind of factual. But we have perceptions of what they mean. And that's why I'm calling them a label, right? Because, you know, when I say the word foster kid, you have a picture. And it's probably different from my picture. For a lot of people, the foster system really sucks. Still does. Don't get me started. Makes me mad. Anyway, and he was raised in an Italian home with a lot of Native brothers and sisters. And so we just feel really, like I feel, even though my label doesn't recognize it, I feel very aligned with Natives because there's so many of my family, so many of my closest family is Native. My foster uncles, and some of them became my brothers for a while because my parents raised them. My grandparents were getting elderly. And this is getting really long and I really apologize, but labels hold so much. I could just keep unpacking them. And I guess I'm getting really personal and self-revealing here, but I'm trying to keep it specific and real because this is, you know, about making it practical. And you can see how all these labels, they mean so much difference. Like, I mean, what does a cultural label mean when you say Italian? I mean, what does that conjure up? Like really overweight, fluffy grandmas that bake a lot. Yeah, like, I mean, the stereotype is actually pretty accurate for a stereotype, like for a generalization. Problem with labels is, while they're accurate, 60 to 80% of the time, there's still that 20 to 40% of the time where they don't fit. And so here you are trying to communicate something to someone by using a label to try and help them to understand you better or your situation better. But they've got an image in their mind. And so these labels, they break down. And so you can have these arguments because of your interpretation of these words. If you want to make this practical for you, when it comes to labels, use appropriate ones when they're appropriate. But always remember they're limited because the other person on the other side hearing that label has a different view. And it's always your responsibility to make sure you can express that and to continue the dialogue in a really kind way through questions to be able to make sure the person understands you. When I say understand, it doesn't mean agree. Let's get that clear. Anyways, if you want some practical information, because we could go on all day about communication, I'm going to do some more videos on communication. And I do have a short webinar series. I think it's like 1 hour, 2 hours on my website. So you're welcome to check that out. But I hope that was at least a little helpful. I know this went quite long because there's just so much going on here when it comes to labels and using them and understanding them and how we relate to the words we hear. Anyways, so put your comments below. What labels do you put on yourself? Which ones are beneficial? Which ones are not? And which ones are neutral? Like, well, sometimes they're beneficial, sometimes they're not, and sometimes they are what they are. Go ahead. Put your comments down below. You can even put your criticisms, but please be kind because I'm real. We're all real with real problems and real failings. Thank you for watching.